The morning Harlan Briggs rode onto the Whitmore property, he didn't knock. He didn't have to. Men like Harlan never knocked. They arrived with papers and witnesses and the particular smile of someone who had already decided how things would end. He dismounted in the frozen mud of the yard, looked at the sagging fence line and the frost-cracked barn wall, and that smile widened into something that had no warmth in it at all. 30 days, he said, loud enough for the neighbors 2 farms over to hear. That's what the bank gave you. 30 days was 3 weeks ago, Miss Whitmore. Clara stood in the doorway with flour on her hands and her father's medicine smell still on her dress, and she did not move. You've got until sundown tomorrow, Harlan said. After that, I start counting furniture. He was still smiling when he rode away. If you've ever stood in a doorway watching someone take your life apart and felt your hands go completely still, you already know how this story begins. Stay with us. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a like if you're already feeling something, and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that frozen yard, and to the woman who hadn't yet decided she had anything left to lose. The Whitmore Ranch sat 7 miles east of a town called Granger's Fork, which was less a town than a collection of buildings that had agreed to stand near each other. It had a post office, a feed store, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge came through, and a reputation for not forgetting anyone's worst moment. Clara Whitmore had grown up understanding that reputation. She'd watched it work on her mother during the bad harvest year, watched neighbors look away in the dry goods store when her family's credit was refused, watched the particular arithmetic of small-town sympathy that calculated exactly how much trouble a person was in before deciding whether to offer help or distance. She was 26 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a left hand that had been broken badly at 15 and healed slightly crooked, which meant she could feel weather changes 2 days before they arrived. In another life, that might have been useful. In this one, she mostly used it to know when to bring in the washing. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had been sick for 14 months. Not dramatically sick, not the kind of sick that produced deathbed speeches and meaningful glances. Just steadily, expensively, exhaustingly sick in the way that ground a household down to its bones. He'd had a lung infection that the doctor in Granger's Fork treated for 3 months before admitting he was out of his depth, which meant a trip to the larger town of Redfield, which meant a doctor who charged 3 times as much and knew twice as much and still couldn't fully fix what was wrong. Edmund was alive. He was breathing. He sat by the window most days with a blanket over his lap and watched the property he'd built with his own hands slowly stop being his. Clara's brother Thomas had left 18 months ago for the mining camps in the Northern Territories. He sent money when he had it, which was less often than his letters promised. Clara had stopped counting on the letters arriving when they said they would, and stopped counting on the money arriving at all. That left Clara. She'd taken on laundry work for 4 of the households in Granger's Fork. She'd sold 2 of their better horses. She'd renegotiated the feed terms with old Gerald Hatch at the supply store, who was kind enough not to mention that her credit was already stretched past what kindness could cover. She'd planted the kitchen garden twice over, putting in late crops that had no business surviving the altitude, and some of them had. None of it was enough. Harlan Briggs had been buying up land in the Granger's Fork Valley for 3 years. He didn't farm it, he didn't run cattle on it, he held it, and he waited. And occasionally he let it be known to people who'd been asking questions that he had arrangements with certain men in the Territorial Land Office whose names it wouldn't be polite to repeat. The Whitmore Ranch sat at the eastern end of the valley, where a spring creek ran year-round, the only guaranteed water source on that side of the valley, and Harlan had decided he wanted it. He'd bought the debt from the bank 4 months ago. Clara hadn't known until the letter arrived with his name on it instead of the bank's, and by then the terms had already been rewritten in ways that were perfectly legal and completely impossible. The sundown deadline he'd given her was real. She'd had Gerald Hatch's son, who'd studied law for 2 years before coming home, look at the papers. He'd read them twice and then set them down carefully on the table like they were something that might bite. "There's nothing here that can be fought," he'd said. "Not in the time you have." Clara had thanked him and walked home and stood in the barn for a long time with her forehead against the neck of their oldest remaining horse, which was 15 and half blind and not worth selling. She didn't cry. She'd found, over the past 14 months, that crying used energy she needed for other things, and she'd gotten very efficient about deciding what to spend herself on. What she was trying to work out was whether there was anything left she hadn't tried. She was still working on that question 2 days later when the stranger came. She heard the horse before she saw the man, a single set of hoofbeats coming up the track from the road, unhurried, which already distinguished this arrival from Harlan's people who always came fast, like their business was urgent enough to punish the ground. Clara was splitting wood behind the house, and she straightened up and waited. The horse that came around the side of the barn was a brown animal of no particular distinction, old enough to have opinions about the pace it set, moving with the confidence of a horse that had covered serious ground and knew its own limits. The man on its back looked like the horse had assembled him from spare parts, boots worn through at the right heel, a coat that had been good quality about a decade ago, a hat that had been reshaped by rain so many times it had stopped resembling its original intention. He was maybe 30. It was hard to say. His face had been outdoors long enough to make guessing age complicated. He stopped at a distance that was polite. That was the first thing Clara noticed. He stopped far enough back that she could look at him without feeling crowded. "I'm looking for the Whitmore property," he said. "You found it." "You'd be Clara Whitmore." It wasn't a question, which she didn't like. "That depends on what you want with her." The man looked at the woodpile, at the barn, at the house behind her. Not the way Harlan's men looked at property, calculating square footage and water access. More the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand. "I heard you've got a debt problem," he said. Clara set the axe against the splitting block. "Half the valley's heard that. Most of them just talk about it." "I'm not here to talk about it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper which he held out without moving the horse forward, waiting for her to come to him or not. "I'm here to offer to pay it." She didn't move toward the paper. "Why?" "Because I need something in return." "What?" He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone choosing words carefully to manipulate. She'd gotten very good at reading that particular silence. This was something different, the quiet of someone who knew exactly what they were going to say and was deciding whether the moment was right to say it. "A wife," he said. Clara looked at him for a long time. "Get off my property," she said. He didn't leave. He also didn't push. He just sat on his patient old horse with the paper still extended and waited while she picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, and the sound of the blade hitting the block was the only sound in the yard for what felt like a very long time. "My name is Caleb Voss," he said, after she'd split 4 pieces. "I know you don't know me. I know this sounds like something a person says right before it gets worse, but the offer is real. I'll pay what you owe to Briggs, and I'll pay the doctor's bills, and I'll make sure your father has what he needs for as long as he needs it. And in return I marry a stranger and go off into the mountains with him." "Yes." "You understand how that sounds?" "I do." "Then you understand why I'm telling you to leave." "I understand why you're saying it," he said. "I'm not sure you actually want me to." That stopped her. Not because it was persuasive. It wasn't. It was presumptuous, and she recognized that. But she also recognized, with the part of herself she'd gotten very quiet over the past year, that he wasn't wrong. She didn't want him to leave. She wanted him to turn into something that made sense. She wanted this to be a real option, not the kind of desperate bargain that ended with her in a worse situation than the one she was trying to escape. She put the axe down. "Talk," she said. They sat on the back step of the house because Clara wasn't going to invite a stranger inside to meet her sick father, and the conversation needed to happen somewhere. She'd brewed coffee because her hands needed something to do, not because she was offering hospitality. Caleb Voss held the mug without drinking from it for a long time, and he talked. He said he lived in the mountains north of Granger's Fork, in a valley most people in town didn't know the way to. He said he'd lived there for 6 years. He said he had resources sufficient to clear her family's debt 3 times over and still have considerable left. "You live in those mountains," Clara said, "and you ride into town looking like that." "Like what?" "Like a man who sleeps in his coat." Something moved through his expression that might have been amusement. "There are reasons I don't advertise what I have." "What reasons?" The same reasons a man with a good card hand doesn't let everyone at the table see it. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. Not yet. She studied his hands around the mug. They were working hands. She'd grown up around enough of them to know the difference between hands that had done real labor and hands that had been near labor occasionally for appearances. His were the real kind, scarred at the knuckles, one finger healed slightly wrong at the middle joint. She noticed him notice her noticing. "What exactly do you need a wife for?" she said. "And don't give me a pretty answer. Give me the true one." He set the mug down on the step between them. "I run a business," he said. "It's grown to a size where certain decisions require a partner, someone who can speak for the operation when I can't, someone who can hold things together if something happens to me. The men I work with respect competence. They don't respect a man who can't secure his own house." He paused. "There are also people who want what I've built, not in the way Briggs wants your land, not through legal maneuvers, through other means. Having a wife who's capable of defending what we have matters, not with a rifle, with a head." Clara was quiet. "You've been watching me," she said. It wasn't an accusation exactly, more a thing she was deciding how to feel about. "I heard about your situation. I asked questions. What I heard about the woman who'd been fighting Briggs for months without a single real resource to fight him with, that was the answer to a question I'd been trying to solve. You want someone capable. I want someone who already proved they are, under pressure, without advantages. And you couldn't find this person somewhere closer to you. I looked." He said it simply, without drama. "I didn't find her." Clara stood up and walked to the end of the small yard and looked out over the frozen field that her father had broken ground on 23 years ago with a single mule and borrowed tools. She knew every inch of that field. She knew where the soil went thin at the northeast corner and where the drainage collected in wet springs, and where her mother had planted the apple tree that still barely survived despite having no business being at this altitude. She was thinking about what Thomas would say. Thomas would say this was a trap. Thomas would say no woman should bargain herself away to a stranger. Thomas wasn't here. She was thinking about what her father would say. Her father would say, "Ask more questions." Her father, even sick, would say that a man who answers questions badly under pressure will answer everything else the same way. She turned around. "What happens if I go with you and it doesn't work?" she said. "Define doesn't work. If I can't do what you need, if the partnership doesn't hold, if you decide you made the wrong choice. You'd have money, enough to start somewhere else without needing anyone's help." He said it without hesitation, which told her he'd thought about it already. "I'm not looking to trap someone. A trapped person isn't useful. A partner has to choose to be there." "And what about the other way around? If I'm the one who doesn't hold to what I promised?" "Yes." "Then you'd be in a worse position than you're in now," he said. "And I wouldn't have any excuse for it, but I don't make promises I don't keep. I found it's not worth the accounting later." Clara walked back and picked up her coffee mug and looked at him over the rim of it. His face was still. Not the stillness of someone hiding something. She'd gotten very good at reading that too. The stillness of someone who'd been in enough difficult situations to stop performing for them. "I need to speak with my father," she said. "Of course. And I need to know one more thing. Ask. What's the name of what you have up there? The business, the land, whatever you're calling it." He looked at her with something that was almost respect. "The Voss Timber Company," he said. "Most of the territory knows the name. They just don't know the face behind it." She absorbed that. The Voss Timber Company was not a small name. Even in Granger's Fork, where people were more concerned with hay prices than territorial commerce, the name had come up. Large operation, Northern Mountains. Nobody she'd ever met knew the man who ran it. "Give me until morning," she said. Edmund Whitmore listened to his daughter explain the situation from the chair by the window with the blanket on his lap, and his face went through several expressions that he didn't comment on, and when she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "You trust him," he said. "Not a question." "I don't know him well enough to trust him," Clara said, "but I don't think he's lying. There's a distance between those two things." "I know." Her father looked out the window at the yard. The light was going gray and thin in the way it did before a hard freeze. "What did his hands look like?" he said. Clara smiled, just slightly, because her father had always said that. Look at the hands. Real, she said. The kind that have done the work. Edmund nodded slowly. The Voss timber operation is a real thing, he said. I heard about it from the Kellerman brothers when they came through from Redfield 3 years ago. Said it was one of the largest timber operations in the North Territory. Said no one had ever met the man who owned it. He coughed once, carefully, the careful kind that meant he was managing it. Said his workers stayed. Said that was the thing that was unusual. Men who went to work for Voss came back with money and said they'd go back. Clara sat with that. It doesn't mean the offer is what he says it is, she said. No. Her father turned from the window. His eyes, even sick, were sharp. But it means he's built something real over a long time and hasn't run it into the ground. That's not nothing. He looked at her directly. What's your instinct? My instinct is that this is dangerous, Clara said. My instinct is also that tomorrow Harlan Briggs is going to start counting our furniture, and my instinct has never found a solution for that. Her father was quiet for a long time. Your mother would have wanted better for you than a business arrangement with a stranger. I know. But your mother also would have said that half the marriages she knew started the same way. And the question was never what it started as. He reached out and put one hand, bony and warm, over hers. The question was what both people decided to make of it. Clara sat with her father until he fell asleep, which didn't take long. Then she sat a while longer in the quiet of the room, listening to the house settle in the cold, and thought about a valley in the mountains she'd never seen, and a man who'd come to her doorway with a proposition that made no sense and somehow kept making more of it the longer she sat with it. She went out to the barn before dawn. Caleb Voss was there, asleep in the hay in the corner of the empty stall, his coat pulled around him, his horse standing at the end of the lead line, looking philosophically at the wall. He hadn't asked to come inside. He hadn't assumed he'd be invited. She stood in the barn doorway until he woke, which happened quickly, the way people woke when they'd spent time in places where sleeping too deeply had consequences. He sat up and waited. I need to know the terms, Clara said, written down. Every obligation, yours and mine, what you're paying, what I'm agreeing to, what happens if either of us breaks it. I can have it drawn up in Redfield within the week. I want it before I go anywhere with you. That's reasonable. And I want to be able to send my father money, regularly, not dependent on whether things are going well. I'll set up an arrangement with the bank in Redfield before we leave. He'll receive it monthly. And if I decide after a year that this isn't working and I need to leave, we'll put a number in the agreement, a fair one. Clara looked at him sitting in the hay in the early morning cold and thought about all the things she couldn't know from looking at a man. She thought about her father's voice, what both people decided to make of it. All right, she said. Caleb Voss stood up and brushed the hay from his coat. I'll go to Redfield today and have the papers drawn, he said. We can marry at the end of the week. One more condition. He waited. We tell Harlan Briggs in person before we leave. I want to see his face. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not quite a smile, but the edges of one. I'll be there, he said. The wedding happened on a Thursday in the office of the county clerk in Granger's Fork, with the clerk and his assistant as witnesses. Clara wore her good dress, which was a deep blue wool that she'd mended twice at the hem, and which still looked decent if the light wasn't examining it too hard. Caleb wore the same coat, which she'd decided to stop commenting on. Her father had held her hands before she left and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing he could have offered. She'd pressed her forehead to his and left before she could make the mistake of crying. The signing of the papers took 4 minutes. The clerk, whose name was Aldous Trent, had the particular expression of a man who'd seen every variety of human transaction pass across his desk and had stopped having opinions about them. When it was done, Clara Whitmore, who was now, in the eyes of the territorial government, Clara Voss, walked out of the clerk's office and found Harlan Briggs standing in the street outside. He'd heard. Of course he'd heard. This was Granger's Fork. He looked at Caleb standing beside her in his worn coat on his patient old horse, and his expression went through several adjustments that he didn't succeed in controlling. Voss, he said. Briggs, Caleb said. Not unfriendly. Not friendly either, just naming a thing. Harlan looked at Clara. The smile he'd worn the morning he rode onto her property was gone. What replaced it was something calculating and not quite done yet. This won't change what you think it changes, he said. It changes what it changes, Clara said. The debt's paid, the papers are filed. You can speak to our attorney in Redfield if you have questions about the specific numbers. Harlan looked at her for a moment with the look of a man revising his estimate of something. You made a fast decision, he said. I had practice, she said. You gave me enough deadlines. She turned and walked to where her horse was tied, and Caleb fell into step beside her, and neither of them looked back at Harlan Briggs standing in the mud of the main street of Granger's Fork, with his calculation running behind his eyes. But Clara heard him say quietly, to no one in particular, "This isn't finished." She believed him. She filed that belief carefully, in the place where she kept the things she would need to think about later. For now there was a road heading north, and a horse that knew where it was going even if she didn't, and a man riding beside her who had offered her a bargain that still didn't entirely make sense, and mountains ahead that she had never once in her life entered. She had married a stranger. She had left her father's land behind her. She had watched a powerful man's face shift into something that promised she hadn't heard the last of him. And somewhere in her chest, underneath the fear and the uncertainty, and the very reasonable suspicion that she might be making the worst decision of her life, there was something else. Something she hadn't felt in 14 months of fighting and losing ground one piece at a time. She didn't have a name for it yet, but it felt, cautiously and against all reasonable evidence, like the first day of something. The road north out of Granger's Fork turned bad within the first 2 miles. Not dramatically bad. No washed-out bridges or fallen trees blocking the way. Just the gradual, honest deterioration of a track that fewer and fewer people used. The ruts growing deeper and less predictable. The frozen mud giving way in patches to loose shale that made the horses pick their steps carefully. Clara had ridden difficult ground before. What she hadn't done was ride it beside a man she'd known for less than a week, in the direction of a life she couldn't picture, with Harlan Briggs' parting words still sitting in the back of her throat like something she'd swallowed wrong. She rode and said nothing for the first hour, which she suspected Caleb noticed and which he had the sense not to comment on. The country changed around them as the morning wore on. The valley floor with its frozen fields and fence lines fell behind, and the terrain began to climb and narrow the way mountain country does. Not all at once, but insistently, the hills pressing in from both sides until the road was less a road than a suggestion between ridge lines. The sky was low and white. The cold was the dry kind that didn't bite so much as settle, getting into the spaces between things and staying there. Clara pulled her coat tighter and watched Caleb's horse ahead of her on the narrowing track and thought about her father in his chair by the window, watching the same gray sky from 7 miles south, and made herself stop thinking about it because that road went nowhere useful. How far? She said. Caleb glanced back. Today we make it to Prentice Station. It's not much, a trading post and a few buildings. We'll stop the night there. And after that, 2 more days, the last part isn't a road anymore. She absorbed that. What is it? A path I know, he said. The horses know it too. Your horse, maybe. Yours will follow. He said it without particular confidence, just as a fact he'd observed about horses generally. They don't like uncertainty any more than people do. If the animal in front knows where it's going, the one behind settles. Clara looked at the back of his coat and thought that might be the most he'd said at one stretch since they'd left Granger's Fork, and she wasn't sure if it was meant to be reassuring or if he was just talking about horses. Prentice Station was 4 buildings and a corral, and a man named Dutch, who ran the trading post and apparently also ran everything else, including the 2 rooms in the back that were available for sleeping if you were willing to accept that available and comfortable were not the same word. Clara got 1 room, Caleb got the other, and Dutch provided a meal that was mostly beans with ambitions toward something more, and a fire that worked better than the chimney had any right to allow. There were 2 other travelers at the station, a pair of brothers moving freight south who ate fast and disappeared into their room without making conversation. Dutch himself sat at the end of the table after the meal with a tin cup of something that wasn't coffee and looked at Clara with the open curiosity of a man who'd given up on being subtle some years back. "You're the Whitmore girl," he said. "Edmund's daughter." "I was," Clara said. "I'm Voss now, apparently." Dutch looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at his cup. "Didn't know you'd gotten married," Dutch said to him. "It's recent," Caleb said. "How recent?" "This morning," Clara said. Dutch absorbed this with the practiced neutrality of a man who'd heard most things. "Well," he said, "congratulations to you both, I suppose." Caleb pushed back from the table. "I'm going to check the horses," he said, and went out, and Clara sat with Dutch and the fire and the sound of the wind picking up outside, and Dutch refilled his cup and didn't say anything for a moment, which she appreciated. "He's a fair man," Dutch said finally. "I've known him, I don't know, 7 years maybe, since before he built the operation up to what it is." "What is it?" Clara said. "Exactly. He told me the name and I know the reputation, but he hasn't told me much else." Dutch looked at her with something that recalculated slightly. "He didn't tell you?" "He told me enough to sign the papers. He hasn't told me the rest." Dutch turned his cup in his hands. "Well, I'm not going to be the one to get ahead of what he wants to tell you himself. But I'll say this. What he's built up there is real, and it's substantial. And the people who work for him know the difference between a man who runs an operation because he inherited it and a man who built it from a bad start." He paused. "He had a bad start." "What kind?" Dutch shook his head. "His story to tell?" Clara looked at the fire. "He came to me," she said, "offered to clear my family's debt in exchange for this, whatever this is." "I know," Dutch said, "or I figured. That sounds like him." He set down his cup. "He doesn't do things without thinking them through 3 times. If he came to you specifically, he had reasons. That's not nothing." "That's what everyone keeps telling me," Clara said, "that it's not nothing, because it's true." She went to her room not long after and lay on the narrow bed in her coat because the room's single blanket was not sufficient to the temperature, and listened to the wind and thought about reasons. Caleb's reasons for choosing her reasons for saying yes, whether those 2 sets of reasons were compatible or were going to turn out to be 2 different maps to 2 different places. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep, which meant at least she fell asleep. The second day's riding was harder and quieter and more beautiful than anything Clara had seen before, which she hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with. She'd grown up in mountain country, but the lower kind, foothills really, the mountains you could see from the valley floor, but not the ones that looked back at you on the same level. These were different. By midday they were high enough that the tree line had changed character entirely, the pine stands growing dense and dark and close to the trail. And the trail itself was exactly what Caleb had said. Not a road, not even a proper path, just a line through the landscape that someone who knew it could follow, and someone who didn't would walk past without seeing. Caleb knew it. That was clear. He moved through it without hesitation, reading the terrain the way Clara read weather with her crooked left hand. Not consciously, just as a thing the body knew. He took turns she wouldn't have seen until he was already through them. He knew where the ground went soft under a crust of frozen snow, tested it without showing her he was testing it, redirected them around it before she'd registered the problem. She started paying attention to this in the way her father had always told her to pay attention. Not to what people said, but to what they did when they thought nobody was keeping score. On the second afternoon, she rode up beside him on a stretch wide enough to allow it. "You know this trail like you built it," she said. "I did build part of it," he said. "The middle section. The rest was already there." "Who made the rest?" "My father." She waited to see if he'd continue. He did, but slowly, the way a man does when he's not accustomed to talking about something. "He came north in the territories about 40 years ago," Caleb said. "Started cutting timber, just him and 2 other men. Found the valley by accident, or what passes for accident. He had a good eye for terrain. He ran the operation until I was 15, and then he couldn't anymore. Couldn't. He got sick, different than your father, faster. He was gone by the time I was 16. Clara absorbed that. "You ran it at 16. "I tried to. I made most of the mistakes you can make and some that I invented." He said it without self-pity, just as a record of events. The men who stayed, the ones who didn't leave when my father died, They're the reason there's anything left to inherit. I owe them more than money can cover. But you pay them well anyway. He looked at her sideways. Yes. Dutch said your workers stay. Most of them. He paused. The ones who leave usually have reasons that have nothing to do with me. Family, somewhere else. Better opportunity. I don't hold people. Clara thought about Harlan Briggs, who held everything he could get his hands on just to watch it stay still. The contrast was not subtle. Tell me about the uncle, she said. Caleb's shoulders shifted slightly. Not much. Enough. Victor, he said. Is that his name? Victor Voss, my father's younger brother. He was quiet for a moment. When my father died, Victor came, said he was there to help, said a 16-year-old couldn't run an operation this size, which was true, and I was in no position to argue it. He managed the business side for 2 years. What happened at the end of 2 years? I looked at the books. Clara waited. He wasn't stealing exactly, Caleb said. He was redirecting. Payments going to accounts I didn't know about. Contracts signed with men who were his associates. Timber going to mills he had arrangements with at prices that left money on the table. He shifted in the saddle. When I confronted him, he said I didn't understand how business worked. Said he'd been building relationships I'd benefit from. Said I was an ungrateful child. What did you do? I told him to leave and not come back. Caleb said it flatly. He left. He didn't stop coming back. Meaning, he's been trying to find a way back into the operation for 10 years. Through investors, through the territorial land office, through men who owe him favors. A pause. He's been telling people for years that I'm not capable of running what my father built, that I'm isolated, eccentric, unfit for the business side of it, that the operation needs proper leadership, meaning him, or someone he controls. Caleb glanced at her. 2 months ago, I learned he'd arranged a meeting, a formal one, with 4 of the largest investors in the territory who have interests in the timber trade. He's going to make his case that the Voss operation needs new governance. Clara felt something settle into place. That's why you need a partner. That's part of it. A wife makes you look more settled, more legitimate. A capable wife does, he said. A wife who can hold her own in a room with powerful men does. A wife who understands what's being protected and why, that does. He looked straight ahead at the trail. I didn't need a woman on my arm. I needed someone who could think. You couldn't find a woman in the territory who could think. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she heard something she hadn't expected. I wasn't sure I could trust one, he said. Victor's tried that approach too. Twice in the last 4 years, women who came around who seemed available. I found out later he'd sent them. Clara looked at his profile. He wasn't saying this for sympathy. He was saying it because she'd asked a straight question and it deserved a straight answer, and she found she respected that more than she wanted to. So how do you know I'm not one of those? She said. Because you told me to get off your property, he said, and because Victor doesn't know about your family situation. I was careful about that. I came to you without going through anyone who could have told him. You researched me before you came. I asked questions, yes. That's a strange thing to admit to your wife on the second day of knowing her. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face and disappeared. I suppose it is. They rode in silence for a while after that, but it was a different silence than the mornings. Not the silence of 2 people who didn't know what to say, but the silence of 2 people who had said enough for now, and were letting it settle. They came into the valley on the 3rd morning, and what Clara saw stopped her horse without her meaning to stop it. She'd been prepared for something. She hadn't been prepared for this. The valley was wide and deep, sheltered on 3 sides by ridgelines that broke the worst of the winter wind, and through the center of it ran a river that was still moving despite the cold, dark, and fast over a bed of pale stones. On the near side of the river, arranged with the practical logic of a real operation rather than the planned tidiness of a model town, stood more buildings than she could count at a glance. A mill, its wheels still even in winter, massive and solid. Barns, 3 of them, large enough to mean something. A cluster of worker housing, not grand but solid, smoke coming from every chimney. An equipment yard with tools and machinery she didn't immediately recognize. And further up the valley slope, set apart from the working buildings, but not so far as to be isolated, a house. Not a cabin, a house. 2 stories, timber built, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front and windows that caught the white winter light and threw it back. Clara sat on her horse and looked at all of it. "You said you had resources," she said. "I did. You didn't say—" She stopped because she wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "I know," he said. "I needed you to come because of the situation, not because of the house." She understood that. She didn't have to like it. Understanding things and liking them were separate transactions, and she'd gotten very clear on that distinction over the past year. She clicked her horse forward and rode into the valley. The man who met them at the edge of the equipment yard was somewhere between 50 and 60, with a gray beard trimmed short and eyes that were the same color as the winter sky. And he looked at Clara with a directness that would have been rude coming from most people, but from him seemed to be simply how he operated. "This is Marta's husband, Ren Colbert," Caleb said. "He runs the mill operation." "And everything else when this one's in the mountains," Ren said, not unpleasantly. He looked at Clara. "You're the wife." "Apparently," Clara said. Ren looked at Caleb. "Granger's Fork, you said?" "Yes. Edmund Whitmore's daughter." "I've been hearing that a lot lately," Clara said. "Your father broke the first ground on that East Valley land," Ren said, "before the others came in. A lot of people forget that." He said it with the particular respect of someone who kept track of who'd done the real work and who'd arrived after. Then he turned back to Caleb. "Marta's got the house ready. Rode up yesterday." "Marta is Ren's wife," Caleb said. "She's been keeping the house since—" He paused. "For a long time." "Since there was nobody else to," Ren said, in the tone of a man who was accustomed to filling in the gaps his employer left. He looked at Clara again. "She'll show you around." She was relieved to hear someone was coming. "She's been after him," a nod at Caleb. "For 4 years to stop rattling around that house alone." "Ren," Caleb said, "I'm not saying anything that isn't true." Clara almost smiled. Marta Colbert was a small woman in her 50s who moved fast and talked in the direct, efficient manner of someone whose time was genuinely limited and who'd stopped apologizing for it. She showed Clara the house in the way someone shows a house when they know it well and want to make sure the new person knows it too. Not a tour exactly, more a transfer of operational knowledge. This is where the water comes from. This is where the food stores are. This is how the chimney damper works. And if you set it wrong, the upstairs gets smoke, so don't set it wrong. Clara followed and asked questions and did not pretend to already know things she didn't, which seemed to be the right approach because Marta's manner shifted from formal to something approaching genuine as they went through the rooms. The house was larger than it looked from the outside. A main room with a fireplace big enough to walk into, a kitchen that had clearly been designed by someone who intended to cook serious quantities of food, a study off the main hall that was so full of maps and ledgers and stacked papers that the actual floor was no longer visible, 2 bedrooms upstairs, a small one, and a large one. Clara stood in the doorway of the large bedroom and looked at it. Marta stood beside her with her arms crossed. "He's been sleeping in the study," Marta said. "Has been for years. I don't know if that changes or doesn't change. That's between you and him. But I wanted you to know the room is actually used for sleeping when it needs to be." "I appreciate you saying that plainly," Clara said. "I say everything plainly. It saves time." Marta looked at her sideways. "Are you afraid?" Clara considered the question honestly. "Of what exactly?" "Of being here. Of all of it." "I'm not sure afraid is the right word," Clara said. "I'm paying attention to a lot of things at once." Marta nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer. "He doesn't talk much," she said. "In case you haven't noticed, he means well by it. He's not cold, he's just quiet. But if you wait for him to tell you things, you'll be waiting a long time. You'll have to ask." "I've noticed I can ask him things." "Good, then you're already ahead." Marta uncrossed her arms. "The men here are decent. They'll respect you when they've seen reason to. Don't try to earn it fast. They notice when someone's performing. Just do the work and let them see you doing it." "What work?" "Whatever needs doing." Marta said it simply. "There's always something." That afternoon, while Caleb was in the mill with Wren going over winter inventory, Clara went to the study. She stood in the doorway and looked at the mess of it. The maps pinned to every surface, the ledgers stacked in columns she could see were organized by some system she didn't yet understand, the papers with figures and notes in a handwriting that was cramped and precise and difficult to read. She went in and sat at the desk and started reading. Not snooping, not looking for anything specific, just reading, the way she'd always approached things she didn't understand, starting at the beginning and moving forward until the shape of something became clear. She was 3 ledgers in and had the general outline of the operation in her head: timber volume, mill output, contract terms with 2 major buyers in Redfield and 1 in the larger city of Fort Carver. When Caleb came in and stopped in the doorway, he looked at her at his desk with 3 of his ledgers open around her and said nothing. "Your margin on the Redfield contracts is wrong," Clara said, without looking up. "Or the expenses aren't being tracked against them the way they should be. The output numbers are right, but something's eating the difference." Silence. She looked up. His expression was unreadable. "I went to school for 2 years in Redfield," she said. "My father wanted me to have some business education. He said land was only as good as your ability to understand what it was worth." She paused. "Also, I had to keep the books for our household for 3 years when there was nothing left to hire anyone with. I know what a ledger is supposed to look like." Caleb walked in and looked over her shoulder at the page she had open. She could feel him close behind her and made a deliberate choice to keep looking at the page. "The supply account," he said after a moment. "What about it?" "It's been running higher than it should for about 8 months." He reached past her and turned 2 pages back, pointing to a column. "Here. I've been trying to find where it's going." Clara looked. She ran her finger down the column and then cross-referenced to another ledger, and then she saw it. Not where the money was going, but where the record of it had been made slightly wrong, in a way that would take a long time to accumulate into something obvious. "Someone's been adjusting the supply entries," she said. "Not by much each time, but it compounds." She looked up at him. He was looking at the ledger with an expression that was not quite anger, but related to it. The expression of a man who'd suspected something for a while and was now seeing confirmation of what he'd suspected. "How long has Victor had contact with your operation?" she said. Caleb straightened up. "He shouldn't have had any." "That's not what I asked." A long pause. "One of the men he had contact with, before I found out and the man left, worked the supply procurement for 3 months last winter. And the adjustments start 8 months ago," Clara said. Caleb looked at her. "Someone new in the supply role," she said. "Someone your departed man might have told how to record things a certain way before he left." "I don't know that." "No, but it's worth finding out." She closed the ledger carefully. "I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying the numbers suggest something's wrong in exactly the place where wrong is most useful to someone who wants to show that your operation is mismanaged." Caleb sat down in the chair against the wall, the only other chair in the room, and looked at her with the sustained attention of a man recalculating something. "You read 3 ledgers in 2 hours," he said. "I read fast." "You found something I've been looking for months." "You've been looking in the output numbers," she said. "I started from the expenses because that's where you hide things if you want them found slowly." He was quiet for a moment. "The meeting with the investors," he said. "Victor's arranged it for 6 weeks from now, in Fort Carver." "Then we have 6 weeks." "To find out who's adjusting the entries and stop it, and document what Victor's been doing, and—" He stopped. "And figure out what we're going to say when we're in the room with them," Clara said. "Yes." She stood up from the desk. Her back ached from the riding, and her hands were cold even inside, and she was in a house she'd known for 4 hours, surrounded by people she'd known for less than a day. But the shape of the problem was in her head now, and problems with visible shapes were things she knew how to approach. "I'll need to understand the full operation," she said. "Not just the ledgers, the mill, the contracts, the workers, the supply chain, all of it. That'll take more than 6 weeks to learn thoroughly." "I don't need thoroughly," she said. "I need enough to see what's wrong and be able to explain it to people who are deciding whether to trust you." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "I'll start tomorrow," he said. "Wren will help. He knows more about the operation than anyone." "Good." She moved toward the door. "One more thing. Yes. The supply man who's been adjusting the entries, don't confront him yet. If Victor's watching, and I think he is, confronting him tells Victor we're looking. Let him keep adjusting. Just start keeping a parallel record. Caleb Voss sat in the chair against the wall of his study that was too full of papers and looked at the woman who'd been his wife for approximately 40 hours. "All right," he said. Clara went to find Marta and ask where the extra blankets were kept, because the bedroom was cold and she intended to sleep in it, and there was a great deal of work starting tomorrow. Behind her, in the study, she heard Caleb pull the ledger she'd been reading toward him and start going back through the numbers from the beginning. She didn't smile, but she thought about it. The parallel ledger was Clara's idea, and she built it herself, starting the morning after she arrived and working on it every evening after supper, while Caleb went back to the mill or the equipment yard to finish whatever the day had left undone. She used a blank record book she'd found in the supply cabinet, one of several, which told her Caleb had always intended to be more organized than he managed to be, and she began entering every supply transaction twice, once as it appeared in the official ledger, and once as it should have appeared based on the actual receipts she pulled from the wooden box under the supply desk where Caleb kept his paper records in the approximate order of whenever he'd had time to deal with them. The receipts were a mess. That was the first real problem. Not deliberately concealed, just poorly managed. The natural accumulation of a man who was better at running an operation than recording it. Clara spent the first 3 evenings just sorting them into chronological order. And somewhere in the third evening, Caleb came in from outside and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her work and didn't say anything. "You could help," she said without looking up. "I'd slow you down." "Probably. But you know which receipts go with which supplier, and I don't yet." He sat down across from her and picked up the nearest stack and started sorting. They worked for 2 hours without talking much, and the silence was the productive kind that Clara had always found more comfortable than conversation for its own sake. By the time the fire had burned low, they had the receipts in order, and Clara had cross-referenced enough of them to see the shape of what she'd suspected more clearly. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about financial manipulation done carefully. It was never dramatic. It was a small adjustment here, a slightly inflated figure there, a supplier invoice that had been entered at one amount and receipted at a lower one, with the difference sitting in a line item called miscellaneous procurement, that Caleb hadn't questioned because miscellaneous procurement was a real thing that real operations had. Over 8 months, the accumulated difference was not enough to notice in any single month, but was, when laid out across the full period, enough to matter. And more importantly, when added to 2 other accounts that Clara had found running similarly wrong in smaller amounts, it was enough to make the operation look like it was bleeding money from somewhere nobody could identify, which was exactly what someone would want to show 4 investors in Fort Carver who were deciding whether the Voss operation needed new management. She showed Caleb the completed picture on the 5th night. He looked at it for a long time. She watched him track through the numbers, checking her work against the receipts, running the same calculations she had. He wasn't fast at it, but he was careful, and he didn't reach a conclusion until he'd verified it twice. "The man handling supply procurement now, he said. "His name is Dale Purvis. He came from Redfield. I hired him 8 months ago." "Who recommended him?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "He came with a letter from a business contact in Redfield, a man named Holt, who I've done contracts with for years." "And how well do you know Holt?" "Well enough that I didn't question the letter." He set down the papers. "Victor knows Holt." "Yes," Clara said. "I thought he probably did." Caleb stood up and walked to the window and stood there looking at the dark yard for a moment. She could see the particular set of his shoulders that she'd started to recognize as the way he carried anger. Not outward, not loud, but compressed, held in the frame of him like pressure in a sealed container. "If I fire Purvis now—" "Victor knows we found it," Clara said, "and Purvis disappears back to Redfield, and we lose the one person who can confirm where the adjustments were coming from. So we keep him. For now. We keep the parallel record. We let the pattern continue building so the documentation is thorough. And when we're in Fort Carver, we have everything we need to show what's been done and by whom." Caleb turned from the window. You're asking me to watch someone steal from me for 6 weeks and do nothing. I'm asking you to watch someone steal from you for 6 weeks and document everything, Clara said. There's a difference. One of them ends with Victor embarrassed. The other ends with Victor winning. He looked at her with the look she'd started to recognize as the one he used when he was deciding whether she was right and didn't want to admit it yet. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she said. The valley had its own rhythm, and Clara learned it the way she'd always learned unfamiliar things, by getting up early and staying late, and keeping her mouth shut more than felt natural until she understood what she was looking at. Ren Colbert took her through the mill operation on the second day, explaining the machinery with the patient thoroughness of a man who genuinely loved what he'd spent his life building. The mill was impressive in the way that things built to last are impressive. Not flashy, nothing designed for effect. Every component placed where it was because that was where it worked best. The water wheel drove 2 saws in winter, 3 in summer when the river ran higher. The timber came down from the upper valley on a slide system that Caleb's father had designed and Caleb had extended twice. He built the extension himself, Ren said, pointing up the slope to where the timber slide disappeared into the tree line. First winter after his father died, just him and 2 other men, up there for 6 weeks. I told him it would take until spring. A pause. He wanted it done before spring. Clara looked up at the slide. Was it? He missed spring by 8 days. Ren said it in the tone of a man who'd been arguing with the same person for 15 years and had arrived at something between exasperation and pride. He doesn't stop when he should. Never has. Clara filed this under the growing category of things she was learning about her husband that he hadn't told her himself and probably wouldn't. She met the workers in the normal course of being present, at the mill, in the yard, at the long table in the main barn where everyone ate the midday meal together, which was a practice Caleb had kept from his father's operation, and which Clara understood immediately was one of the reasons men stayed. There was something about eating together, about the foreman and the newest hired hand sitting at the same table with the same food, that said something about how a place was run. She'd seen the other kind growing up, the kind where the owner ate separately, above it, and the men knew it and remembered it. The workers were careful around her at first in the way men are careful around a new woman, in a position they haven't figured out yet. She didn't push. She showed up, she did what was useful. She asked questions that were clearly about understanding the work rather than evaluating the people doing it, and she remembered names. That was the thing that shifted things fastest. She remembered every name the first time she heard it, and used it correctly the second time, and the third time asked something specific to the person, where they were from, how long they'd been in the valley, what they thought of the supply schedule. It wasn't a technique, it was just how her mind worked. But it read to people as attention, and attention was something most of the men at the Voss mill had not expected from whoever Caleb eventually brought back from the outside world. By the end of the second week, the man who ran the equipment maintenance, a quiet Swede named Anders, who had 17 years in the valley and the institutional memory of every piece of machinery ever repaired, was explaining the equipment inventory to her without being asked, on the grounds she gathered, that he'd decided she was the kind of person who should know things. By the end of the third week, she was eating at the long table, and the conversation didn't change much when she sat down, which was the real indicator. Caleb noticed. She knew he noticed because he was the kind of man who noticed things and didn't say them, and the things he didn't say accumulated in the space between them in ways that weren't uncomfortable, exactly, but weren't nothing. They had developed a routine that wasn't planned. It had just grown from the shape of the days. Mornings, they worked separately. Midday, they ate with the men. Evenings, after supper, they both ended up in the study, which had gradually become less impossible as Clara reorganized the papers into an order she could work with, and Caleb had stopped leaving his maps on the floor after she'd stepped on one, and he'd looked genuinely pained by it. They talked about the business. That was what the evenings were for, officially. But business conversation has edges, and the conversation ran along those edges sometimes into other territory. His father, her father, the valley in summer which she hadn't seen yet, and which Ren said was worth staying for, the question of what they were going to do about the Fort Carver meeting when it came. One evening toward the end of the third week, he asked about her brother. Thomas, she said, he's in the mining camps, northern territories. Does he write? When he thinks of it, which is less often than I'd like." She paused. "He'd have told me not to come here." "I know." She looked at him. "You know?" "I know the kind of brother who leaves and then feels entitled to protect from a distance," Caleb said. It came out more direct than he probably intended, and she saw him register that. "That's a harsh read," she said. "Maybe." He looked at the fire. "Is it wrong?" Clara thought about Thomas's letters, the ones that promised money that didn't come, and offered advice on her situation that had the comfortable authority of someone who wasn't in it. "No," she said. "It's not wrong." Neither of them said anything for a while. "The bedroom," Caleb said. She waited. "I want to say something about that before it gets uncomfortable to say. All right?" I'm not going to make demands on you," he said. "The arrangement we agreed to, the terms in the papers. The rest of it that's yours to decide. When and whether. I'm not going to pretend I haven't thought about it, but I'm also not going to make it a condition of anything." Clara looked at the fire. The wood had burned to good coals, orange and steady. "I appreciate you saying that plainly," she said, which was a thing she'd said to Marta on the first day, and meant just as much now. "Marta told me I should say it early, or you'd spend energy wondering." Marta was right. She usually is. He stood up, which was what he did when a conversation had reached the end of what it was going to cover. "I'll be in the study another hour." "I know," Clara said. "I'll be asleep before you finish." He went out and she sat with the fire for a while longer and thought about a marriage that had started as a transaction and was becoming something she didn't have clean language for yet. Not friendship exactly, not love, or not obviously. Something that was building from the ground up, which was slower and less certain than the other kinds, but perhaps more solid for that. She went to bed and slept well, which she had found she did here in a way she hadn't managed in Granger's Fork for 14 months. The letter from Victor arrived in the 4th week. It came through the post at Prentice Station, which was how everything came to the valley. Dutch held it and sent it up with whoever was making the supply run. The letter was addressed to Caleb Voss, the handwriting formal and precise in the way of a man who'd learned penmanship from someone who cared about such things. Caleb read it at the table, standing, and his face did the compressed thing. He handed it to Clara without saying anything. She read it. "Victor Voss wrote with the warmth of a man who has decided to forgive you for something you didn't do. He expressed his gladness at hearing of Caleb's recent marriage. He expressed his hope that the new Mrs. Voss would be a settling influence. He expressed his confidence that the Fort Carver meeting, which he framed not as a challenge but as an opportunity to bring additional investment to the operation, would proceed in a spirit of family cooperation." Then, in the final paragraph, he noted that he had taken the liberty of informing the investors that Caleb's new wife came from modest circumstances in the Granger's Fork Valley, and that no doubt her practical background would be an asset in her domestic sphere. Clara set the letter down on the table. "He's already framing you," she said, "to the investors. Before we get there." "Yes." "He's saying I'm a ranch girl who'll be useful in the kitchen." "Yes." She looked at the letter again. "What do you know about the investors?" Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down. 4 men. The largest is a man named Garrett Aldis. Timber interests, transport contracts, some banking in Fort Carver. He's 70. He started from nothing, and he's harder to fool than Victor thinks he is. He ticked them off. Second is a man named Samuel Cranes. He inherited money and has spent 30 years trying to prove he deserves it. He follows whoever he thinks is strongest in the room. Third is a woman, Margaret Fell, which is the only reason Victor is nervous, because he doesn't know how to read her. She has a logging operation in the Eastern Territory, and she's been in expansion mode for 2 years. And the fourth, a man named Cord Barrow. He paused. Cord knows Victor personally. He's been in business with him before, minor things, and he'll come into the room already inclined to support whatever Victor proposes. Clara absorbed this. So we need Aldis, Fell, and enough of Crane to make Barrow irrelevant. That's the math, yes. Then we go to Fort Carver, and we don't walk in as the frontier couple defending their territory. She pulled the letter toward her and read Victor's final paragraph again. We walk in as the people who found the problem that everyone else missed and documented it cleanly. Caleb looked at her. Victor's going to attack your background. I know. In front of those people. He's going to say you're not qualified to be in the room. I know, Clara said again. Let him. You're not worried about that. She looked up at him. Caleb, I've been managing books, negotiating credit terms, arguing with a man who had territorial lawyers behind him, and I had my father's stubbornness and a garden that had no business surviving. I'm not worried about a room of investors who need to be persuaded by evidence. She tapped the ledger she'd been working from. I have evidence. He was quiet. What worries me, she said, is Purvis. Whether he's going to be there. Whether Victor's going to try to produce him as a witness. Caleb thought about that. He might. So before we leave for Fort Carver, I need to have a conversation with Purvis. What kind of conversation? The kind where he understands that we know exactly what he's been doing, and that the question of whether that information goes to the territorial authorities depends entirely on what he decides to do in the next 2 weeks. Caleb looked at her steadily. You want to turn him? I want to give him a choice, Clara said. He's a man who was told to do something and did it. Whether he did it because he needed the money or because he thought Victor would protect him doesn't matter now. What matters is that he's sitting on information about who directed him to do it, and right now he thinks his best option is to stay quiet and hope we don't know what we know. And you're going to show him we do? Yes. And offer him what in return? His record stays quiet, and we don't pursue the adjustment amounts if he provides a written account of who contacted him and what he was asked to do. She looked at Caleb. He probably won't give us Victor's name directly. Victor's too careful for that. But he'll give us something, a name, a meeting place, a letter, something that connects. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. You've thought about this for a while. Since the second week, she said. I was waiting until we had the documentation complete enough that the offer meant something. He stood up and walked to the window, which was what he did when he was working something through. She waited. If Purvis goes to Victor after you talk to him, then Victor knows we're ready, and he either cancels the meeting or comes to it knowing we have documentation, Clara said. Either way, we're not worse off than we are now. Victor's already planning to destroy you in that room. Us being prepared doesn't change his plan. It just changes the outcome. Caleb stood at the window for a full minute. All right, he said. Talk to Purvis. She talked to Purvis on a Thursday morning in the supply building with the door open and Anders working within sight outside because she wasn't foolish enough to have a private conversation with a man she didn't trust. Dale Purvis was maybe 40, with the compact, watchful look of a man who had learned to read rooms quickly and adjust accordingly. He was organizing supply receipts when Clara came in, and he looked at her with the careful neutrality of someone who had been careful around her since she arrived. Mrs. Voss, he said. Sit down, Mr. Purvis, Clara said. He sat. She sat across from him and put the parallel ledger on the table between them, open to the first month of adjustments, and she watched his face. He was good. His expression didn't change much, just a slight tightening around the eyes, quick as a blink, and then the careful neutrality was back. I've been going through the supply accounts, Clara said, as I expect you know. I heard you taken an interest in the books, he said. I've taken an interest in this particular pattern. She turned the ledger to face him and put her finger on the first entry. This entry and these 17 others over the following 8 months represent a consistent adjustment between the receipt amounts and the recorded amounts. Not large individually, significant in aggregate, she paused, and notably consistent in method, which suggests training rather than error. Purvis looked at the ledger. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't entirely readable. I don't know what you think you're seeing, he said. I think I'm seeing a man who was given instructions on how to adjust supply entries in a way that would make this operation appear to be losing money. It isn't losing, Clara said. I think he followed those instructions because someone told him it was safe to do so. She folded her hands on the table. I'm here to tell him that it isn't safe. Not anymore. The silence in the supply building was the kind that had weight. I have a complete parallel record, Clara said. Every adjusted entry with the original receipt, with the correct amount, with the date and the difference. It's documented clearly enough that the territorial auditor would understand it without assistance. She kept her voice even. What I don't have yet is the name of the person who arranged for those instructions to reach you. Purvis was very still. I'm not going to pretend I'm offering you something generous, Clara said. I'm offering you a choice between two bad options. The worst one is that this documentation goes to the territorial authorities with your name on every entry. The other one is that you provide us with whatever you have, a letter, a name, a meeting, that connects these instructions to their source, and your name stays out of the official record. And you just take my word for it, Purvis said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the calculation running underneath it. I'll take whatever you can document, Clara said. Letters. A name I can verify. Anything that has more substance than your word alone. He looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. She didn't fill the silence. I kept a letter, he said finally, so quietly she almost didn't catch it. She waited. I kept it because... He stopped, started again. Because I didn't fully trust that he'd protect me if it went wrong. That was smart, Clara said. Where is it? Not here. He looked at the doorway, at Anders moving around in the yard. I'd need to get it. You have until Sunday, Clara said. Bring it to me Sunday morning. He nodded once, the nod of a man who'd made a decision he wasn't happy with and was already living inside it. Clara stood up and picked up the ledger. Mr. Purvis, whatever you were promised by whoever sent you here, it was worth less than what you're being offered now. I want you to be clear on that. She left him sitting at the supply table and walked back out into the yard, and the cold hit her face and she breathed it in and did not let herself react until she was around the corner of the barn and out of his line of sight. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the particular physical release that came after holding yourself absolutely still under pressure for longer than was comfortable. She pressed her back against the barn wall and breathed until the shaking stopped. Purvis brought the letter on Sunday morning, as agreed. It was not from Victor directly. That would have been too clean, and nothing about this was clean. It was from a man in Redfield named Caleb Voss. No relation to the family name, just a coincidence that would have been funny in different circumstances. Who ran a small freight brokerage, and who was, as 3 hours of cross-referencing to one of Caleb's older ledgers revealed, a man who had done business with Victor Voss twice in the past 6 years. The letter didn't name Victor. It named Purvis and gave instructions on the entry method, and mentioned a payment that had apparently been made through the freight brokerage. But it was on paper, in a handwriting that could be traced, from a man who could be found, and it was enough to build from. Caleb read it in the study that evening with the careful look he had for things he was deciding how to feel about. Voss, he said. You know him. I know of him. Victor used him as a middleman for a land negotiation in '89. I remember because the negotiation went badly and Victor blamed the middleman. He set the letter down. He uses people and then blames them when things don't work. Yes, Clara said, which is why Purvis kept the letter. Caleb looked at her. You knew he would have something. I thought he might. Men in Purvis's position usually keep something. It's the only insurance they have. She paused. I didn't know it would be enough. Is it enough? It connects Victor to Voss. It connects Voss to Purvis. It connects Purvis to the adjustments. It's not a confession, but it's a chain. She looked at the letter. Combined with the documented adjustments and the timing, 8 months, starting shortly after the man Victor previously had contact with left the operation, yes. I think it's enough for the investors to understand what's been happening. Caleb was quiet. What? Clara said. Victor's going to walk into that room in Fort Carver planning to take apart the person I married, he said. He doesn't know what she's put together. She looked at him. There was something in his voice that she hadn't heard before. Not pride exactly, but something close to it, and something protective underneath that. He's going to find out, she said. The night before they left for Fort Carver, Clara wrote a letter to her father. She sat at the desk in the study while Caleb was making sure the horses were ready for the early start, and she wrote Edmund Whitmore a letter that was honest in the way she'd always been honest with him, without softening things that didn't need to be soft. She told him about the valley, about the mill and the river and the way the mountains looked in the early morning when the light was still thin and the frost on the pine stands caught it. She told him about Marta, who had taken to sending food home with the supply riders that went toward Granger's Fork with the instruction that some of it should find its way to the Whitmore house. She told him about the ledgers and what she'd found and what it had led to. She didn't tell him she was happy, because she didn't know if that was the right word yet, and she didn't want to use words imprecisely with her father. She told him she was busy, which was true. She told him she was sleeping, which was true. She told him that the man she'd married was not what either of them had thought he was, meaning that in the most important ways. Then she wrote, "I think the question you asked me, what both people decide to make of it, I think we've started making something. I don't know what it looks like yet from the outside. From the inside, it looks like work, and I've always been better at work than at most other things." She sealed the letter and left it for the next supply run. Then she went to find Caleb and tell him she was ready, and in the morning they rode south out of the valley toward Fort Carver, with the documentation in a leather case that Clara kept on her saddle, and the mountains at their backs, and 6 weeks of careful preparation between them and the room where Victor Voss was waiting. She was not afraid. She was paying attention, which had always served her better than fear. Fort Carver was 3 days' ride from the valley, and Clara spent most of those 3 days reviewing the documentation she'd assembled and trying not to rehearse what she was going to say in the meeting, because rehearsed things sounded rehearsed, and she knew it. The town itself was larger than she'd expected, larger than Granger's Fork by a factor that made comparison almost meaningless. It had a proper main street with brick buildings, 2 banks, a telegraph office, a hotel that had 4 stories, and a dining room with tablecloths. After 2 months in the valley, where the nearest thing to a crowd was the midday meal at the long barn table, the noise and density of it hit her like a physical thing when they rode in. They stayed at the hotel. Caleb had a room reserved, which told her he'd been planning this trip regardless of how the preparation went. She noted that without comment. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, which gave them one evening and a morning. Caleb used the evening to speak with Garrett Aldous, who was apparently the kind of man who preferred to talk before formal meetings rather than during them. Clara wasn't invited to that conversation, and she didn't ask to be. Instead, she sat in the hotel dining room with a cup of coffee and the documentation spread on the table in front of her and went through it one more time, not because she didn't know it, but because the physical act of reviewing it settled her. A woman at the next table watched her work with open curiosity. Middle-aged, well-dressed in the way that came from money that had been around long enough to stop trying to announce itself. "You look like you're preparing for a trial," the woman said. "Something like that," Clara said. "Are you one of the parties tomorrow?" It wasn't really a question. "Margaret Fell," the woman said. "I'm one of the investors." Clara looked up properly. Margaret Fell was perhaps 55, with gray at her temples that she hadn't troubled to hide and eyes that processed things quickly and without apparent sentiment. "Clara Voss," Clara said. "The operation under discussion is my husband's." Margaret Fell looked at the papers on the table. "And you're the one who prepared for it." "We both did." Margaret looked at her with the particular attention of someone reassessing a first impression. Victor Voss told Samuel Crane that Caleb's new wife was a ranch girl from a small valley operation. He said it with the tone men use when they want you to picture someone serving coffee. "I noticed he'd framed it that way," Clara said. "I thought you might have." Margaret's expression wasn't quite a smile, but it was something adjacent. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mrs. Voss." She left, and Clara sat with her coffee and thought that the meeting had already started, in the way that meetings always start before anyone is officially in the room. Caleb came back from his meeting with Aldous late, after Clara had gone upstairs. She heard him in the hallway. His room was next to hers, separated by a wall thin enough that she could hear him moving around. She lay awake for a while after, and thought about the morning. In the morning, she knocked on his door before she went down to breakfast, and he opened it looking like he'd slept about as well as she had, which was to say imperfectly, his shirt not yet buttoned all the way and his hair needing attention. "How was Aldous?" she said. "Sharp," Caleb said. "He's already heard things from Victor's direction. Not specific things. Victor's careful about what he says directly, but the suggestion that the operation has been showing financial irregularities." "Which it has been," Clara said. "That's the part Victor designed." Yes, Aldous didn't say he believed it, but he heard it. Caleb finished buttoning his shirt. He asked about you. What did you tell him? That you found the irregularities and documented them. He paused. He said that was interesting. Did he say it like it was interesting, or did he say it like he was being polite? Caleb looked at her. Like it was interesting. Good, Clara said. Then he'll be paying attention this afternoon. The meeting room was on the second floor of the Fort Carver Commercial Bank, which was appropriate since money was the actual subject of everything that was about to be said. It was a large room with a long table and 8 chairs, and when Clara and Caleb arrived, 3 of the 4 investors were already seated. Garrett Aldous sat at the far end of the table, not at the head, deliberately not at the head, in the way of a man who'd learned that the person at the head of the table spent the meeting defending the position instead of observing it. He was older than Clara had pictured, and smaller in the physical sense, and his eyes were exactly the kind that came from 70 years of watching people try to get something from him. Samuel Crane was beside him, younger, soft in the jaw, his suit more expensive than anyone else's in the room. He sat with the slightly forward lean of a man trying to look attentive. Margaret Fell sat across from them and looked at Clara when she came in with a brief nod that confirmed nothing except that she had registered her presence. Cord Barrow arrived 2 minutes later, followed by Victor Voss. Clara had built a picture of Victor Voss from Caleb's descriptions, and from the letter he'd sent, and from the shape of what he'd been doing to the operation for the past 8 months. The picture she'd built was of a man who was clever and patient, and had the particular confidence of someone who'd never really been caught at anything. The actual Victor Voss was perhaps 60, with Caleb's height but heavier through the shoulders, and a face that had the settled authority of someone who'd decided long ago that he was the most capable person in most rooms and had arranged his life to avoid being contradicted. He wore a good coat and moved with ease, and when he looked at Caleb across the table, there was something in his eyes that was almost affectionate. The affection of a man who'd decided he was forgiving you for existing. Then he looked at Clara. She watched him do what she'd expected him to do. Make the assessment, reach the conclusion, decide she was what he'd already decided she was. She'd seen that look before. Harlan Briggs had looked at her that way from horseback in the frozen yard. The difference was that Briggs had been right to underestimate what she had at that moment, because at that moment she'd had almost nothing. She had considerably more now. Caleb, Victor said, taking his seat with the ease of a man settling into furniture he'd already decided was his. I'm glad you came, and this must be your wife. He smiled at Clara. The smile was practiced and not unkind in the way a scalpel isn't unkind. Clara, is it? Caleb tells me you've been getting acquainted with the Valley operation. I have, Clara said. Wonderful. It's good for a man in Caleb's position to have a supportive presence at home. He said it to the table in general, the way you include the room in a pleasantry that's directed at one person. Shall we begin? Victor opened the meeting the way someone opens something they've rehearsed, smoothly, with the shape of reason and the texture of concern. He talked about the Voss operation with the particular tone of a man who loves something and is pained by its decline. He cited numbers, the output figures for the past 2 years, the contract margins, the supply expenditures. The numbers were real. That was the thing Clara had understood from the beginning. The numbers Victor was citing were real, because Dale Purvis had made them real. And the picture they painted was of an operation that was losing efficiency in ways that pointed toward mismanagement. Samuel Crane leaned forward and asked a clarifying question about the supply costs, and Victor answered it with the fluency of someone who'd memorized the material, and Cord Barrow nodded slowly in the way of a man confirming what he'd already thought. Garrett Aldous listened without expression. Margaret Fell wrote something in the small notebook she'd brought. Caleb sat with his hands flat on the table and said nothing, which was what they'd agreed. Let Victor finish. Let him put everything on the table. Don't interrupt. Clara sat beside Caleb and watched Victor work and felt, underneath the attention she was paying, something that was almost like calm. Not the forced calm of suppressed nerves. The actual kind that came from knowing exactly what she was holding. Victor concluded his presentation with a proposal, formal language for what amounted to a restructuring of the operation's governance that would bring him in as a managing partner with decision authority over contracts and financial management, with Caleb retaining the land and the physical operation while ceding the business side. He said it as though he were offering something. He said it with genuine seeming regret that it had come to this. Then he looked at Caleb with that forgiving look and said, "I think you know this is the right solution for the business your father built. You've done well with what you had, Caleb, but the operation has grown beyond what one person can manage without the right support." The room was quiet. Caleb looked at Clara. That was the signal they'd agreed on, though it wasn't much of a signal. Just a look. But it meant, "Your turn." Clara set the leather case on the table and opened it. "I'd like to present some information about those supply expenditures," she said, "since they seem to be the primary basis for the concern Mr. Voss has raised." Victor's expression shifted slightly. Barely. "I'm not sure this is the moment for—" "Mr. Aldous," Clara said, looking at the end of the table, "would you be willing to look at some figures before the group reaches any conclusions?" Aldous looked at her. "I would," he said. She distributed the documentation, copies of the parallel ledger, the original receipts with the correct amounts, the adjusted entries with the differences marked, the 8-month accounting of the total discrepancy. She'd had them written out clearly, in a hand that was legible without being labored, laid out so that a person unfamiliar with the Voss operation's specific accounting could follow the logic without assistance. She gave everyone a moment to look at the first page. "What you have in front of you," she said, "is a comparison between the supply account entries in the official ledger and the actual amounts on the original receipts. Starting 8 months ago, the entries were adjusted, consistently, in a specific pattern, always upward from the receipt amount, never randomly, but always in the same direction." She paused. "The accumulated difference over 8 months represents a significant distortion of the operation's apparent efficiency. The operation hasn't been losing money. The records have been made to look like it is." The room was very quiet. Victor said, "That's a serious accusation." "It's a documented observation," Clara said. "The accusation, if there is one, follows from the document." Crane was looking at the pages with the expression of a man who'd expected to follow a clear path through this meeting and had just found the path rerouted. Barrow had stopped nodding. Margaret Fell was reading carefully and writing in her notebook. Aldous looked up. "Who made the adjustments?" "A man named Dale Purvis, hired as supply procurement manager 8 months ago," Clara said. "He came to the operation with a letter of recommendation from a freight broker in Redfield named Gerald Voss." She reached into the leather case and produced the letter Purvis had given her. A copy, the original secured separately. Mr. Voss's letter to Mr. Purvis contained specific instructions on the entry method. The letter was written on the freight brokerage's paper, in Mr. Voss's hand, and contains a reference to a payment arrangement. She set the letter on the table. "Gerald Voss," Margaret Fell said, not loudly, "has done freight brokerage work for Victor Voss on at least 2 occasions in the past decade. I know this because one of those occasions involved a contract dispute that touched a route I also use." The quality of the silence in the room changed. Victor's face had done something complicated and then reassembled itself. "Gerald Voss is a business contact of many people in this territory," he said. "The fact that he sent a letter of recommendation to a job candidate at the Voss operation is notable," Aldous said, "given that you're the one proposing the operation needs new financial oversight, and the financial irregularities were created by a man connected to your business associate. I would caution against—" "I'm not making a legal determination," Aldous said. The 70-year-old voice was perfectly level. "I'm noting that the documentation Mrs. Voss has presented raises questions about the basis of your proposal that I would want answered before I considered supporting it." Cord Barrow, who had spent the meeting so far nodding and leaning toward Victor's side of the table, had stopped doing both. He was looking at the letter with the expression of a man recalculating his position. Victor turned to Clara with the look of someone who had decided to change approaches. "My dear," he said, and his voice had a new texture now. Patient, explanatory, the tone you use with someone you're about to explain something to. "I understand you've been working very hard to support your husband. That's admirable. But these figures, I think you may have misread the accounting structure. Supply operations at this scale have legitimate cost variants that can appear as the receipts are in the case if anyone would like to verify them, Clara said. I have originals for every entry I've cited. The suppliers are named on each receipt. Any of them can be contacted to confirm the amounts they were actually paid. Victor stopped. She'd said it quietly. That was the thing she'd decided in the valley, reviewing the documentation for the 20th time, not to raise her voice. Raised voices were for people who needed volume to compensate for something. She didn't need to compensate for anything. The receipts are verifiable, she said. The letter is a physical document. The timeline, 8 months of adjustments, beginning shortly after a man with connections to your business associate joined the operation in the same period you were arranging this meeting, is documented. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking this group to conclude anything about intent, she said. I'm asking them to look at what's been documented and consider whether it changes the picture that was presented before I put these papers on the table. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Margaret Fell said, to no one in particular, it changes it considerably, in my view. What happened next wasn't dramatic in the way that stories sometimes make things dramatic. Victor didn't confess. He didn't collapse. He pushed back, carefully, with the practiced fluency of a man who'd been in difficult rooms before, and he raised questions about the documentation and suggested alternative interpretations and implied, without quite saying it, that a woman who'd come from a small ranch operation in a minor valley was perhaps out of her depth in a meeting of this kind. He said it with a smile. He said it to the table in general, not to her directly. Aldous said mildly, she seems to understand ledgers considerably better than the man you're proposing to replace her husband with. Barrow very quietly asked Victor how well he knew Caleb Voss. Victor answered. Barrow asked a follow-up question. His voice had changed. Not hostile, but careful in the way that people are careful when they've just noticed they were standing on ground they hadn't tested. Clara didn't say much after the initial presentation. She'd learned from 3 years of managing impossible situations with insufficient resources that the moment you've made your case clearly and completely, talking more is usually just noise. She answered direct questions. She referred people back to specific pages of the documentation when they had questions about figures. She did not fill silence with her own voice when silence was doing the necessary work of letting people think. At one point, Victor looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the forgiving look, not the dismissive one. Something harder and more honest. You've been preparing for this since before you left the valley, he said. Since before I left Granger's Fork, she said, although I didn't know that's what I was preparing for. He absorbed that. You're smarter than I expected, he said. He didn't say it as a compliment. He said it as an assessment, the kind a man makes when he's reworking a calculation. Most people are, Clara said, when they have reason to be. The meeting ended without a formal vote, which was how these things apparently worked. Not with a show of hands, but with the gradual withdrawal of energy from one position and its movement toward another. Victor's proposal was not voted down. It simply became clear, over the course of 2 hours, that the support it needed wasn't there. Aldous said he would want to review the documentation further before any governance discussions continued. Margaret Fell said she agreed. Crane, watching which way Aldous was moving, said he thought a thorough review was prudent. Barrow said very little after his questions about Voss, which was itself a kind of answer. Victor left first. He stood and made the appropriate closing remarks with the professionalism of a man who intended to find another approach, and he looked at Caleb once more with that look. But it was different now, recalibrated, and Clara thought it would be a long time before Victor Voss underestimated the Voss operation again. Caleb held the door. When Victor was gone, Aldous looked across the table at Clara. Mrs. Voss, he said. The parallel ledger. You built that yourself. Yes. How long did it take? About 3 weeks to construct completely. About a week to verify. Aldous nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has spent 70 years watching people do hard things and has developed a specific respect for the ones who do hard things without fanfare. I'd like to speak with your husband about the supply management situation when you have the time, he said. I have an interest in seeing the Voss operation continue to succeed. He paused. It's been one of the consistently well-run operations in the territory for 30 years. I'd prefer it to remain that way. So would we, Caleb said. After Aldous left, Margaret Fell lingered. She put her notebook in her bag and looked at Clara with the direct look that Clara had noted from their first conversation in the dining room. "The man who processed your debt in Granger's Fork," she said. "Briggs. Yes. He's been trying to acquire the water rights on that East Valley land for 2 years. He's run into legal problems with 2 of the other acquisitions he made." Clara looked at her. "What kind of legal problems?" "The kind that come from not reading the original land grants carefully enough." Margaret fastened her bag. "The Whitmore land grant, your father's original claim. I'd look at the original documents if I were you. The water rights on that Spring Creek may not have been properly transferred when the debt was assigned, which would mean Briggs doesn't own what he thinks he owns." A pause. "I have no particular stake in this. I simply noticed it, and I thought you should know." She left. Clara stood in the empty meeting room with Caleb and the leather case and the papers still spread across the table, and she looked at him. "She didn't have to say that," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. "We'd have to verify it." "We would." She started gathering the papers, fitting them back into the case in the careful order she'd established. Her hands had stopped shaking before the meeting started and hadn't shaken since. She was tired in the specific way that came after sustained attention released its grip, the tiredness that felt like something finishing rather than something failing. "You were quiet in there," she said, deliberately. "You had it," Caleb said. "You weren't worried." "I was worried." He said it simply. "But I'd seen the documentation, and I'd watched you with Wren, with Anders, with the men at the table. I knew what you could do in a room." He picked up the leather case. "Worrying and not trusting aren't the same thing." She looked at him. He was holding the case and looking back at her with the steady look she'd come to know, the one that didn't perform anything. "The water rights," she said. "If Margaret Fell is right, then Briggs's hold on your father's land is weaker than it looks. And my father is still living on land that's supposed to belong to Briggs. Let's look at the original grant documents before we decide what it means," Caleb said. "But yes." Clara snapped the leather case closed. The ride back to the valley would take 3 days, the same as it had coming. She thought about Wren at the mill, and Marta with her efficient manner and her unrequested food parcels going south to Granger's Fork, and Anders explaining machinery with the love of someone who'd built his life around understanding things. She thought about the ledgers she'd been maintaining and the work still to be done on the supply accounts, the changes she wanted to propose to the contract terms with the Redfield buyers, the question she'd been holding for 2 weeks about whether the timber slide could be extended again and what the output implications would be. She thought about her father in his chair by the window, watching the property that might, with enough careful work, become something other than Harlan Briggs's eventual possession. She thought about Caleb saying, "Worrying and not trusting aren't the same thing." She picked up her coat from the chair. "There's something I want to look at on the ride back," she said. "The original land grant documents. I wrote to the county clerk in Granger's Fork 3 weeks ago and asked for copies. They should be waiting at Prentice Station." She looked at him. "I wasn't sure we'd need them, but I thought it was worth having them." Caleb stood very still for a moment. 3 weeks ago," he said, "around the same time I was thinking through the Fort Carver presentation. You were building 2 cases at the same time." "One case and one contingency," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet in the way that she'd come to understand was his version of being moved by something, which was to say he didn't show it outwardly, but the quality of the quiet was different. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Nothing attached to it, no qualification, no explanation of what he was thanking her for. He didn't need to explain it, and she didn't need him to. "The horses should be rested enough to leave tomorrow morning," she said. "They should," he said. She walked out of the meeting room and down the stairs of the Fort Carver Commercial Bank into the cold, bright air of the street, and the town moved around her with its noise and its commerce and its ordinary human business, and she walked through it toward the hotel thinking about water rights and land grants and the particular satisfaction of work that had been done right, done completely, and done in time. She didn't let herself think about what it meant that she was thinking about home, and the thing she was thinking of was the valley. She'd think about that later, when she had time to be honest about it. For now there was the ride back, and the papers waiting at Prentice Station, and a problem with Harlan Briggs that might, with enough careful reading of the right documents, turn out to be more solvable than it had looked from a frozen doorway 7 months ago. She went into dinner. The documents from the Granger's Fork County clerk were waiting at Prentice Station, as Clara had arranged, bundled in brown paper and tied with the practical efficiency of Aldous Trent, who had been county clerk for 22 years and folded paperwork the way other people folded laundry, with the automatic precision of long habit. Dutch handed them over with his usual lack of ceremony. "Came 4 days ago," he said. "Figured you'd be through." Clara took the bundle and untied it at the trading post table, while Caleb saw to the horses and Dutch made coffee that was better than it had any right to be given the equipment he made it with. She spread the documents out and read them in the order they'd been filed, starting with Edmund Whitmore's original land claim from 23 years ago. The original grant was 3 pages, hand-copied in the formal language of Territorial Land Administration, naming the boundaries of the Whitmore claim and describing the water rights attached to it. The language was dense and specific in the way legal documents were specific when the person drafting them had been trained to leave nothing ambiguous. Clara read it twice. Then she read the assignment document, the transfer of the Whitmore debt from the Granger's Fork Bank to Harlan Briggs, which had been filed 4 months ago and which Gerald Hatch's son had reviewed and found legally airtight. The assignment document was airtight. Gerald Hatch's son had been right about that. What he hadn't looked at, what nobody had looked at because nobody had thought to, was the original land grant specific language around the Spring Creek water rights, which were described in a subordinate clause on the second page in terms that referred to a territorial statute from 16 years ago governing water access on homestead claims. The statute had been amended 9 years ago. Claire sat very still with the papers in front of her and thought about the amended statute and what it meant for the water rights language in the original grant. And then she thought about what Margaret Fell had said in the meeting room. "I simply noticed it, and I thought you should know," with the particular offhandedness of someone who noticed things precisely and chose carefully what to do with what they noticed. Caleb came in from the horses and looked at her face and stopped. "What?" he said. "The water rights on the Spring Creek weren't transferred with the debt," Clara said. "They couldn't have been. The original grant ties them to a statutory provision that was amended 9 years ago. The amendment requires a separate filing for water rights on homestead claims to be assigned to a non-farming entity." She looked up at him. "Briggs is a land collector. He's not a farming entity. The filing was never made because whoever handled the assignment didn't read the original grant carefully enough to know it needed to be." Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "So the Spring Creek water rights are still attached to the original claim," Clara said, "which means Briggs owns the land, but he doesn't own the water access. And in a valley where the Spring Creek is the only year-round water source on that side, the land without the water is worth a fraction of what he paid for it," Caleb said. "It's worth less than what my father's debt was," Clara said, "which means Briggs overpaid for something he can't fully use, and he did it because nobody read the paperwork." Dutch set 2 cups of coffee on the table and went back behind his counter with the tact of a man who had learned when not to listen. Clara looked at the documents. The thing she was feeling was not triumph, exactly. It was closer to the particular exhaustion that comes when a problem you've been carrying for a very long time finally shows you its actual shape, and the shape turns out to be something you can work with. Triumph would have been too clean for what this was. This was complicated, the way real things are complicated, because it didn't give her father his land back. It gave her a legal argument, which was different, which required a lawyer and a filing and time. "Harlan Briggs is not going to give this up without a fight," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. "He'll get his own lawyers. He'll try to argue the amendment doesn't apply. He'll delay." "Yes." She looked at him. "This could take a year, longer." "It could." "My father doesn't have—" She stopped. She'd been about to say something about her father's health that she didn't want to say out loud in a trading post in the middle of nowhere, because saying it out loud made it more real than she currently had the capacity to manage. Caleb reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. He didn't say anything, which was the right choice. And after a moment, she turned her hand over and they sat like that for a minute with the documents and the coffee and Dutch's deliberate inattention and the cold outside the door. "What we can do," Caleb said when she was ready to hear it, "is get a lawyer in Redfield to file an injunction on the water rights immediately. That stops Briggs from doing anything with the creek while the claim is being disputed. It doesn't give your father the land back yet, but it means Briggs can't use the property the way he planned to, which means he has a problem. And a man with a problem is a man who might want to negotiate." Clara looked at the papers. "He won't want to negotiate," she said. "Men like Briggs don't—" She stopped again and reconsidered that. She was speaking from the version of herself who'd stood in the doorway watching Briggs ride away and had nothing to bargain with. "Men like Briggs don't negotiate when they're comfortable," she said. "When they're uncomfortable, it's different." "Make him uncomfortable," Caleb said. "Make him uncomfortable," Clara agreed. She picked up her coffee and drank it, and it was exactly as good as it smelled. And she thought that Dutch deserved credit for that because most things in life didn't match their smell. "We file in Redfield on the way through," she said. "I know a lawyer there," Caleb said. "He's good. He's not fast, but he's thorough, and thorough is what this needs." "Set it up," she said. "I'll write the summary for him tonight so he has the argument laid out when we meet." She pulled a piece of paper from the brown wrapping and borrowed Dutch's pencil and started writing. They spent one night in Redfield, which was long enough to meet with Caleb's lawyer, a methodical man named Price, who read Clara's summary with the careful attention of someone who genuinely enjoyed the architecture of a good legal argument, and to file the preliminary injunction on the Whitmore Spring Creek water rights before the end of the business day. Price said the injunction would be served to Briggs within the week. He said the underlying claim would take time to fully adjudicate, but the injunction itself had good standing and would hold while the case was built. He said it with the calm of a man who'd read enough original land grants to know that the people who drafted them hadn't always understood what they were drafting, and that this created opportunities that rewarded careful readers. Clara shook his hand and they rode out of Redfield the next morning into the last stretch of mountain country between them and the valley. And the sky was the hard, clear blue that came in late winter before the first suggestions of a different season. And the road climbed and the horses moved steadily, and neither of them said much. Around midday, on a high stretch of trail with the valley still a day ahead, Caleb said, "When your father's situation is resolved, however it resolves, I want to offer him the option to come to the valley." Clara looked at him. "There's a small house on the eastern slope," he said, "one of the original worker houses from my father's time, but it was built better than the others. Wren and I went through it last fall. It needs work, but the bones are right." He kept looking at the trail ahead. He'd have his own space. He wouldn't be dependent in the way that would bother him. He could be useful if he was well enough, and he could rest if he wasn't. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since your letter," he said. "The one you wrote him before Fort Carver. You left it on the desk to seal, and He paused. "I didn't read it, but I saw that you'd written it, and I thought about what it cost you to leave him there." She looked at the trail. "He'd argue about it," she said. "He'd say he was fine. He'd say the valley was too far and he was too old and he didn't want charity." "Yes," Caleb said. "What would you say back?" "I'd say the valley isn't far if you're already there," she said, "and that it isn't charity if there's work he can do, even small work. He was always better when he had something to account for." She thought about her father at his window, at his sharpness, even sick, at the way he'd asked about Caleb's hands. "He'd want to meet you properly." "I'd want that too," Caleb said. They rode in the comfortable silence that had become, over the past months, one of the things Clara valued most about being with him. The silence that didn't require filling, that trusted the other person to still be there when it ended. They came back into the valley on a Thursday afternoon, and the first thing Clara noticed was that the timber slide had been extended. Not by much, maybe 40 feet at the top end, but enough that the line of it was visibly different from how she'd left it, running higher up the slope into the tree line than it had before. She stopped her horse and looked at it. "Wren," Caleb said, with the tone of a man who had mixed feelings about being preempted. "He told you he was going to do it. He told me he was thinking about it. That usually means he's going to do it." Is it right? Clara asked. The extension. Will it work the way he's placed it? Caleb looked at it for a moment. Yes, he said. He put it at the right angle. I'd have put it 3 feet further left, but his way works too. Then let him have it, Clara said. Caleb looked at her sideways. You're going to tell me that? You were going to argue about the placement. He was quiet. Let him have it, she said again, not unkindly. I wasn't going to make a large argument about it. You were going to mention it, twice. He said nothing, which was itself an answer. Marta came out of the house when they rode into the yard, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at them both with the assessing look she had for anything returning from a distance. Well, she said. Well, Clara said. Victor Voss has sent 2 letters since you left, Marta said. I put them on the study desk, didn't open them because they're addressed to Caleb, but the second one came yesterday and the handwriting looked agitated. Thank you, Marta, Caleb said. Also, Anders fixed the number 2 saw housing and would like you to look at it before he calls it finished. Because he says if you don't see it before it's done, you'll second guess it afterward, and he'd rather get it over with. I'll go now, Caleb said, and dismounted and handed his horse to the young man who'd come from the barn, and went toward the mill with the walk of someone returning to something he understood. Marta watched him go and then looked at Clara. You won, Marta said. It wasn't a question. We made the case, Clara said. Winning is what happens after a lot of other things that take longer. But it went the way you needed. Yes. Marta nodded once, with the contained satisfaction of someone who doesn't make a large show of being right, but doesn't pretend not to be either. Come inside, she said. There's food. Victor's letters were what Clara had expected. The first, written the day after the Fort Carver meeting, was controlled and formal, and made several careful arguments about the documentation she'd presented, suggesting procedural issues with how the parallel ledger had been constructed, and raising questions about the admissibility of the Voss letter as evidence of anything definitive. It was the letter of a man who hadn't given up but was reassessing his approach. The second letter, written 4 days later, was shorter. It dropped the procedural arguments. It said in the flat language of someone who had completed a calculation they didn't like the result of, that Victor hoped the meeting had given everyone the opportunity to address concerns about the operation's direction, and that he remained available to discuss any matters pertaining to his brother's legacy should Caleb wish to do so. It was, in the language that men like Victor used, a withdrawal, not a permanent one. Clara didn't think for a moment that Victor Voss had decided to stop wanting what he wanted. He'd decided that this particular approach, at this particular moment, against this particular opponent, wasn't going to work. He would find another approach. That was the kind of man he was. But the approach would take time to find and build, and time was what they needed. Time to document cleanly, to strengthen the operation's legal structure, to build the kind of record that made future challenges harder to mount. She wrote a brief reply to Victor on Caleb's behalf, acknowledging receipt of both letters and noting that the Voss operation looked forward to continuing its relationship with the investment community on the basis of accurate financial documentation. She wrote it in the formal register that the correspondence required, and she signed it with both their names, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. She showed it to Caleb before she sealed it. He read it and handed it back. It's right, he said. I know, she said. I wanted you to say so. He looked at her. Why? Because it goes out under both our names, she said, and that means both of us should agree on what it says. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way that meant something had landed somewhere real. Yes, he said, it's right. Spring came to the valley in the way that mountain springs come, not like something arriving, but like something returning, the light changing before anything else changed, the quality of the cold shifting from the kind that was finished with you to the kind that was merely passing through. The river went loud with snowmelt, and the timber slide ran full, and the mill saws went from 2 to 3, and the yard was full of noise and purpose from first light until it got too dark to see. Clara had been in the valley for 5 months. She knew everyone's name and most of their histories. She knew that Anders had a daughter in the Southern Territories he didn't talk about but thought about, evidenced by the particular look he got when the supply riders came in. She knew that the youngest of the workers, a 19-year-old named Pete Greer, who'd come up from Redfield with no particular skill set and an evident willingness to work, was teaching himself to read in the evenings using a book he'd borrowed from Caleb's shelf and was too proud to admit he needed help, which Clara addressed by leaving a second, easier book on the supply room table with no explanation and not looking at him when he picked it up. She knew that Ren Colbert had been the real reason the operation survived the 2 years after Caleb's father died, and that Caleb knew this and Ren knew that Caleb knew this, and neither of them ever said it directly, which was a kind of conversation she had come to understand was the most honest kind between men who'd been through something together. She knew that Marta left a lamp on in the kitchen until Caleb came in from the mill at night regardless of the hour, a habit she'd apparently maintained for years without being asked, and that Caleb knew it was there even when he didn't need it. She had proposed 3 changes to the operations contract structure, all of which Caleb had agreed to after the first one worked, and he'd stopped needing to think about it as carefully. She had suggested the worker housing needed a second water source independent of the main line, which Ren had implemented within 3 weeks, and which had already proved its value twice. She had taken over the full management of the supply accounts, which meant Purvis, who had handed over the Voss letter and remained quiet and careful in the way of a man walking a narrow ledge, now reported to her, which was an arrangement he had accepted with the particular resignation of someone who understood his position precisely. She had written her father 6 letters. He had written back 4 times, which was more than she'd expected, and which suggested that either Marta's food parcels were improving his spirits or the letters themselves were doing something. The 4th letter had said, "I spoke with the man Price sent to take my statement about the water rights. He seems competent. Also, your brother wrote to say he's coming back from the mining camps in June. He sounds like himself, which is to say, he sounds like he thinks things are simpler than they are." Clara had smiled at that and shown it to Caleb, and he'd read it and handed it back with the almost smile he used for things he found genuinely funny but wasn't going to make a production of. The letter from Price arrived in late April, on a Tuesday, when Clara was in the supply building going through the spring inventory with Purvis, who had become, in the months since their conversation, something that wasn't quite reformed and wasn't quite comfortable but was usable, which was what the situation required. She read the letter standing in the doorway of the supply building with the spring light coming in from the yard. Price's letter said that Harlan Briggs had been served with the injunction, had retained his own legal counsel, and had initially filed a counter-argument against the water rights claim. It then said that the counter-argument had been reviewed by the Territorial Land Office and found to be without sufficient basis, and that the office had issued a preliminary determination supporting the Whitmore claim's interpretation of the amended statute. It then said that Briggs's lawyer had contacted Price's office 3 days ago with an inquiry about settlement discussions. Clara read the last paragraph twice. She went to find Caleb. He was at the mill with Ren, looking at the extension. The argument about the 3 feet of placement had apparently happened and been resolved, based on the particular settled quality of both their expressions when she walked in. She handed Caleb the letter without saying anything. He read it. Ren pretended to look at something on the slide mechanism with the tact he'd developed for conversations he wasn't supposed to be part of, but was inevitably adjacent to. "Settlement discussions," Caleb said. "He's not going to give the land back without something in return," Clara said. "He spent real money on that debt. He'll want a way to save some of it." "What do we offer?" "We don't offer anything yet," she said. "Price initiates. We find out what Briggs thinks he needs to walk away with his dignity and enough money to call it a business decision rather than a loss." She thought about Harlan Briggs on his horse in the frozen yard, smiling the smile that had nothing warm in it. "He's not going to be gracious about this." "That's all right. We don't need gracious, we need the paper." "The paper," Caleb said. "My father's name back on the land," Clara said. "That's what we need from this. Everything else is negotiable." The negotiation took 6 weeks. Price handled it with the methodical patience he'd shown in every other aspect of the case, and Briggs's lawyer pushed on every point in the way that lawyers push when their client is losing and needs to feel like the losing was hard to accomplish. In the end, it settled on terms that gave Briggs a portion of the debt value back, not the full amount, nothing close to the full amount, but enough that his lawyer could frame it as a negotiated resolution rather than a defeat. In return, the Whitmore land claim was reassigned. Edmund Whitmore's name went back on the original grant. Price sent the final documents to the valley with a note that said, in his dry way, "Your reading of the statutory amendment was correct. I've used the argument in 2 subsequent cases. Clara held the final document in the study on a Wednesday evening in late May, with the window open for the first time since winter and the sound of the river coming in from the valley below, and Caleb at the other end of the desk doing something with a timber inventory. She had wanted this for so long, wanted it in the specific, hungry, grinding way you want things when you're standing in a doorway watching someone take them from you and there's nothing in your hands. The wanting had been with her every day for more than a year, underneath everything else she was doing and thinking about. Now she had it. The paper in her hands was real. Her father's name was on it. It didn't feel the way she'd thought it would feel. It felt quieter, more like the end of a breath you'd been holding than like anything that had a name in the usual vocabulary of feelings. She sat with it for a while, just holding it, until Caleb looked up from his inventory and saw her face. "It came," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you all right?" She thought about the question honestly, the way her father had always wanted her to answer questions. Honestly, not efficiently. "I've been fighting for this for so long," she said, "that I don't quite know what to do without it as a fight." Caleb set down his pen. "That's the thing about fights," he said. "You get used to carrying them, and when they're done, you have to figure out what to put in that space." "Is that from experience?" "Victor," he said simply, "I spent 10 years with him as the thing I was carrying. When he walked out of that room in Fort Carver, I didn't know how to He paused. "It takes time to figure out what you are without the thing you've been fighting." She looked at him. He said things like that rarely, and when he did, they were always exact, the way things are exact when they've been thought about for a long time before being said. "What did you put in the space?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "This," he said. "You and this." The word landed somewhere in her chest in a way she didn't try to analyze. She'd gotten better over the past months at letting things be what they were without immediately trying to categorize them. She set the document down on the desk. "I want to take it to him myself," she said. "The paper. I want to bring it to him." "Of course," Caleb said, "and I want to ask him to come back with me." She looked at the window, at the last light over the valley. "He won't agree right away. He'll argue. But I want to ask him properly, in person, not in a letter." "When do you want to go?" "Next week. Thomas should be back from the mining camps by then." She thought about her brother, his uncomplicated certainty, his comfortable distance, the letters that promised more than they delivered. "He should be there when I show him the paper. He should see it happen." "Yes," Caleb said. "He should." She thought about what her father had said. "Your brother sounds like he thinks things are simpler than they are." She thought about what it would be like to sit across from Thomas in the Granger's fork house and watch him process what had happened while he was gone, what his sister had done, and with whom, and how. Thomas would have opinions. He always had opinions. But she was no longer a woman who needed anyone's opinions to be smaller than their interference. She rode south to Granger's Fork the following week, Caleb beside her. She had not asked him to come. He had simply, the morning she was preparing to leave, saddled his own horse and been ready when she was. She'd looked at him across the horses and not said anything, and he'd not said anything either, and they'd left together, which was its own answer to a question neither of them had asked aloud. Thomas was there. He'd arrived 2 days before, brown from the mining camp sun and thinner than she'd expected, and carrying the particular edge of a man who'd been away long enough to feel like a guest in his own history. He looked at Caleb when they arrived with the measuring look of a brother, which meant the look that tried to determine in 30 seconds what a man's intentions were and whether he'd earned what he had. Caleb met the look without performing anything. He shook Thomas's hand and said his name and went to help with the horses, and Thomas watched him go and then looked at Clara. "He's not what I expected," Thomas said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who'd feel like a transaction." He said it honestly, not defensively, which was the best version of Thomas, when he was willing to be honest about his own assumptions. "He doesn't feel like a transaction." "No," Clara said. "He doesn't." Edmund was by his window. He looked better than the last time she'd seen him. Not well, Not the kind of better that erased concern, but present in a way that the worst of the winter hadn't allowed. He was following something with his eyes that she couldn't see until she sat beside him and looked in the same direction and understood he was watching Caleb in the yard with the horses, watching the way the man moved around an animal. "His hands," her father said. "I know," Clara said. She put the document on the table beside his chair. He looked at it for a moment before picking it up, the way he always approached things that mattered. A beat of acknowledgement before contact, as though the moment deserved a breath. He read it carefully. He read it the way he'd always read things, without rushing, going back twice to the passages that carried weight. When he set it down, his face was the face of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just set it down in a place where it would stay. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You did this." "We did this," Clara said. "Price did the legal work. Margaret Fell noticed the original problem and told me where to look. Caleb's lawyer made the filings." "You did this," her father said again, not correcting her, just naming the thing he knew. She didn't argue with him. He was right, and they both knew it. Thomas came in from outside and looked at the document on the table and picked it up and read it, and his face went through several things. When he set it down, he looked at Clara with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the older brother look, not the look of someone assessing or advising or worrying. Something more like the look of someone seeing a person they thought they already knew. "Clara," he said. "Thomas," she said. He didn't say the thing he was thinking, which was characteristic of him in the ways that were both frustrating and forgivable. But he reached across and put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and for Thomas that was everything. She asked her father to come to the valley that evening after supper, when the house was quiet and Caleb had gone outside to give them privacy, and Thomas was doing the dishes with the industrious guilt of a man making up for months of absence. Edmund listened to the full description: the house on the eastern slope, the work that had been done on it, the valley in spring, the river, the people. And when she finished, he sat quietly for a long time. "It would be charity," he said. "It would be family," she said. "Which is different." "Not always." "This time," she said. "The house needs someone in it. Marta's been complaining that it sits empty. Wren's been meaning to put a second water line to that end of the slope anyway, and having the house occupied gives him a reason." She looked at her father directly. "You'd be doing them a favor." Edmund looked at her with the sharp eyes that illness hadn't touched. "That's a very careful argument," he said. "I learned from someone who taught me to answer questions honestly," she said. "It's honestly a careful argument. It's also true." He was quiet again. Outside, she could hear Thomas clattering with the dishes, and further off, the sound of Caleb somewhere near the fence line. "He's a good man," Edmund said. Not a question. "He's a complicated man," she said. "He's better at showing it through what he does than through what he says. He thinks before he speaks, which sometimes takes longer than is comfortable." She paused. "But yes, he's a good man." "You didn't expect that." "I didn't expect anything," she said. "I went because there was nothing else. I stayed because—" She stopped. "Because the valley is real, and the work is real, and what we're building is real. And he chose me when he didn't have to, and he chose well, and I'd like to do the same." Her father looked at her for a long moment. "Spring is a good time to move," he said finally. It was as close to yes as Edmund Whitmore ever got on the first conversation, which meant yes. They brought Edmund north in June, when the mountain passes were clear and the valley was in the full noise of its working season. Thomas came too, for the first 2 weeks, partly to help with the move and partly, Clara suspected, because he needed to see where his sister had landed before he could stop worrying about it in the uninformed way he'd been worrying from a distance. What Thomas saw over those 2 weeks was the valley in early summer with the river running high and the mill at full operation and his sister moving through it all with the ease of someone who had been there long enough for the place to have shaped itself around her presence. He saw Wren defer to her on the supply accounts. He saw Anders show her the repaired saw housing with the particular pride of someone who wanted the right person's opinion. He saw the workers at the long table include her in conversation the way they included each other, not carefully, not formally, just as a person who was there and who they trusted. He watched Caleb watch Clara, when Caleb thought nobody was watching him, with the look of a man who was still, months in, slightly surprised by what he'd found, and had the intelligence to know it. On Thomas's last evening, he and Clara sat outside on the porch of the main house after supper, and the valley was going dark in the long, slow way it did in summer, and he said, "I should have been here." "You were in the camps," she said. "I should have come back sooner." He said it without excuse. "I kept thinking you'd ask if you needed me, and you didn't ask, so I thought, I didn't ask because I didn't think you'd come," Clara said. It came out more direct than she'd planned, but she'd decided, somewhere in the past several months, that she was finished softening true things to protect people from their own decisions. And because by the time I knew how bad it was, I'd already figured out that asking wasn't going to fix it. Thomas was quiet. "That's fair," he said. "I know it is." She said it without heat. "I'm not angry about it, Thomas. I'm just not going to pretend it was fine." He nodded slowly. "Are you going to tell me what I should do differently?" "No," she said. "You're a grown man. You'll figure it out or you won't." She looked at the dark valley. "Come back more often. That's the only specific thing." He said he would. She thought he meant it, which was better than it used to be. Edmund moved into the house on the eastern slope and spent the first week arguing that he didn't need the wood already stacked by the door, or the food Marta sent over, or the weekly visit from Clara, which he said was unnecessary and which he was clearly waiting for. He and Wren developed a relationship that Clara could only describe as two men who respected each other's irreverence, and by the third week Edmund had taken on the task of reviewing the Timberslide usage logs, which gave him something to account for and visibly improved everything about him. He met Caleb properly on the second day, and they sat together for 2 hours in the small house, and Clara did not ask what they talked about. When she saw them both afterward, their faces had the same settled quality, which told her enough. The Spring Creek water rights remained with the Whitmore claim. Harlan Briggs sold the Whitmore land, at a loss, to a young farming family from the Southern Territory who had nothing to do with any of them, and they were reportedly good neighbors, which was all anyone needed to know about them. Victor Voss sent a letter in the fall, formal and brief, indicating he had accepted a position with a timber concern in the Eastern Territory. Clara read it and filed it without comment. Dale Purvis left the valley in August, as she'd expected he would eventually, and was replaced by a young woman from Redfield named Iris, who had been keeping accounts for a merchant family and who learned the Voss operations supply structure in 3 weeks and improved 2 parts of it in the 4th. Clara had hired her on a Tuesday after a 1-hour conversation, and Caleb had come in afterward and asked how it had gone. "She's better than Purvis," Clara said. "You knew that in an hour." "I knew it in 20 minutes, Clara said. "I spent the other 40 making sure she knew what she was getting into." Caleb had looked at her with the look that was his version of being thoroughly pleased. There is a particular thing that happens to a person who has spent a long time surviving, not living, surviving, which is that they forget the shape of what they were before the survival became the whole project. Clara had forgotten what she'd been like before 14 months of arithmetic and debt, and watching her father's land slip away made everything into a problem to be solved or a loss to be absorbed. She didn't get that person back. You don't get back the person you were before a hard time. That's one of the true things about hard times that no one says plainly enough. You don't recover the previous self, you build the next one. And the building uses material from the wreckage and what the wreckage taught you, and the thing you build is different, but it can be more yours than the original was, if you're honest about what you're using. What Clara had built, over the course of a year in the valley, over 6 months of ledgers and preparation, and a meeting room in Fort Carver, and a negotiation over water rights in her father's laugh, when he found an error in the timber log, and Caleb's hand over hers at a trading post table in the middle of nowhere, was a life she had not planned and could not have imagined from a frozen doorway in Granger's Fork. She had not married a poor mountain man. She had married a man who understood something she'd always believed without having words for it, that the most important things you build slowly, with your hands and your attention and the willingness to fix what breaks, without pretending it didn't break. She had come into a valley that wasn't hers and made it hers by doing the work. That's the only way anything becomes yours, not by being given it, not by inheriting it, by showing up and doing the work until the thing and the person are no longer separable. The mountains knew that. They'd been doing it for longer than anyone could count, wearing themselves into something solid and permanent through nothing more extraordinary than persistence and time. On a morning in the second fall, Clara stood on the porch of the house with coffee in her crooked left hand, and the hand told her rain was coming by tomorrow, and the valley was loud with the last of the season's work. And Caleb was somewhere in the mill, and her father was somewhere in his log review, and Marta was in the kitchen talking to Iris about something that involved the emphatic use of a spoon, and the river ran fast and cold below, same as it had been running before any of them arrived, and would run long after. She stood there and felt, without sentimentality and without qualification, that she was exactly where the work had brought her. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was hers.